Welcome back, friends, to another exciting virtual tour with the Foss, Waterway, Seaport, and Pretty Gritty Tours. I'm your host, Chris Staudinger, tonight, your guide, taking you down beneath the waters of the Pacific, out here in the Puget Sound, to one of the most dangerous and intriguing wrecks that we have in the region out here. I'm excited to explore the history of this entire thing with you, but I want to take a moment to thank all of those who have made this possible, including our sponsors here at Columbia Bank.
I've been a commercial fisherman for 41 years. Truly is a magical place out there. I've been with Columbia Bank as long as this boat's been to sea. As a commercial fisherman, we have income pulses that are directly related to seasonal activities. If that propeller ain't turning, you're not earning. Columbia Bank tailored this loan to fit our business needs perfectly. They've made me happy as a clam at high tide.
Some exciting stuff coming up at the Seaport, including the reopening. We've finally reached the point where on Thursday, June 3rd, this year, the Seaport is going to reopen Thursdays through Sundays, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., and every third Thursday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., with free admission from 48. And there's a lot of cool stuff going on in the Seaport right now. They are finally finishing up the new boat shop in there, where local shipwrights create these wooden boats by hand. It's really an extraordinary thing. And they're going to be doing private tours of that boat shop if you want to get a little more hands-on, so to speak. Also, if you can't wait to tie the knot, the Seaport is also offering micro weddings in their venue there. And if you haven't been inside the Seaport ever or recently, it is a beautiful building from the early 1900s. It was constructed by these railroad workers that were making trusses for railroad bridges, and they did the cool ceiling that way, but it has just this wall of glass. The north end of the Seaport is just glass, and it's really a beautiful venue right down there on the water. So if you are looking for a micro wedding, there's a venue for you. Don't have to look any farther than that. So good to see you guys. I'm glad everyone's dropping in for this one. It really is a very cool tour, and one that I'm excited to get to share with you guys, in particular because we get to talk to master diver Robert Mester tonight. And this is a two-part thing. We're going to explore the wreck of the SS Governor tonight, a little bit about its story, but then on the anniversary of its sinking, April 1st, we're going to be doing a Q&A session with Robert. So if you guys develop any questions or intrigue or want to know more about the Governor tonight, that'll be your opportunity to really check in with Robert on the 1st and ask anything that you want to. But if you're asking yourselves right now, what the heck is the SS Governor? Why haven't I heard of it? Well, here we go. So like I said, it's one of the more substantial wrecks in the Puget Sound, but not for the reasons that a lot of people think of. And I think it gets eclipsed sometimes because it wasn't as lethal as some of the other ones. For example, the Steamship Pacific, which set sail from Tacoma in 1875 and was rounding out into the Straits of Juan de Fuca, actually had 200 plus people on board, including the daughter of Tacoma settler Job Carr and her, I think, 1-year-old son at the time, and all 200 plus lives were lost when that vessel went down. So it makes significantly more waves, pun intended. But the Governor is in so many ways historically more significant. So allow me to make the case for you guys tonight. Well, like I said, we're also going to be checking in with Bob tonight. So I'll let him introduce himself briefly before we get going.
This is Robert Mester. I live in the Great Northwest. I've been here since the early 70s. And my career started in the military. First time I dipped my feet into saltwater, I knew that something was calling me. And for the last 50 years, 60 years, I spent my life in the ocean, looking at things, recovering things for salvage purposes, government, and new and advancing marine geophysical technology, which just happened to blossom about the time my career started in the late 70s, early 80s.
So, knowledgeable guy. And this is the ship in question. So this is the Governor. And the Governor was part of a whole line of steamships in 1921 that were responsible for conveying the people of Washington, California, and British Columbia all up and down the West Coast. Before the era of jet travel or even really reliable train, and sort of at the time when the Mosquito fleet, this small group of steamships that operated throughout the Puget Sound, was adapting. The steamships here were the major players in transportation out there. They were essentially the SeaTac airport jetliners of the time. And the Governor was a prime example of that type of transportation. It was in so many ways identical to a lot of the other ships at that time. So it was a really good representation of what you would have seen for steamships going all up and down the West Coast from California up to Victoria. And it was the posh way to travel as well. These were very luxurious ships, and especially during Prohibition, they were a nice retreat because they would have onboard casinos and bars, and because they would go up, for example, into Canada, basically once you broke away from shore, it was your opportunity to drink. And so people were all gung-ho to travel around on these things. The Governor itself was a 417-foot passenger ship that was originally constructed in 1907 in Camden, New Jersey. And she was 46 feet abeam, so 46 feet wide, and then had a 29-foot 6-inch draft. Or actually, no, I believe her draft would have been 22 feet, 6 inches. I don't know how much you guys care about the draft or how much the boat dips into the water, ship in this case, but it's there for those who are really interested. And really at this time was pretty extraordinary because she could reach 16 to 25 knots. So when you were trying to get around the world, the ocean was the freeway. This was the way that you could get around. And to do it in style and class, you would book your passage here on one of these steamships like the Governor. And that's just what happened at this particular time. And when the Governor enters our storyline here, she was actually returning from California, coming up the West Coast, made a brief stop in Victoria, British Columbia, and then was bound down for Seattle at that time. And this was really one of the most exciting times to be in the area. You can see a chart here of the Pacific Company's routes all up and down the West Coast here, and they hit every major city. The Pacific Coast Steamship Company went through a couple rebrandings, but this was the company that you would have really known it as. In 1875, I think they were the Pacific Coast Mail Company. I'm pretty sure that's what the SS Pacific with Job Carr's daughter on board was the company of. Regardless, this was a big deal for people to be traveling around this way. While it was normal day-to-day transportation, it was very, very luxurious at the time. And because of their onboard casino and bar, people were really, really amped about it. It was on the evening or early, I guess, in sort of the end of March part there, where everyone got on board in California. And the first thing that you would do when you get on board a vessel like this is check in your valuables with the purser, pictured here. There were a series of safes on board all of these Pacific ships, also the Governor, and the valuables that people were traveling with would have been brought on board at that time and stashed in the safe. And this is going to become significant later, so make sure you take note. Because these families didn't have, necessarily like safe deposit boxes or like Homestar security, they would travel with their high-end stuff. And that could be anything from your expensive silver to gold coins to, in some cases on board the Governor, really nice cars and automobiles at the time, or family jewels, things like that. I think the most unique thing are 2 thoroughbred horses that were on board the SS Governor as it was sailing from California back to Seattle. So it was an inestimable wealth that was on board this ship at the time, because these were also very well-to-do families. Perhaps the most famous on board the Governor that night was the Nordstrom family, of the very same Nordstrom chain from here in Seattle. So there was a considerable amount of wealthy people taking their vast wealth with them in steamship trunks on board this vessel as it was going along. So the plot thickens even more. And again, that was not uncommon. This is not of the Governor. This is the Montana, but it's a good representation of that type of ship cruising around throughout the oceans, loaded down with the wealth of America's families. For us, this ship becomes relevant because as it was coming back on April 1st, it had dropped off some passengers in Victoria and was southbound through the Strait of Juan de Fuca, past the Point Wilson Lighthouse, making its way to Seattle when another ship from the Pacific Steamship Company was misidentified. And there's some confusion here as to what happened, but there is a green and red starboard and port light on the dock near the Point Wilson Lighthouse. And it's the general consensus is at this point that the officers that were on deck of the Governor mistook the running lights of another ship as the dock lights there. There's some speculation, but not confirmed, that there might have been some alcohol involved in the decision-making of this particular crew member. It was certainly very commonplace at the time. But the SS West Hartland ran, just T-boned at basically full speed into the side of the SS Governor. Very, very similar ships. And immediately upon impact, almost tore the ship in two. The impact was enough to rip open a 10-foot wide hole and to peel the steel back on either side of that. The captain of the SS Hartland realized almost instantly what had happened and made the decision that they should go full ahead at this point. And driving the Hartland into the SS Governor ended up being one of the decisions that saved so many people, because by plugging that hole in the ship, they bought them 20 minutes before the Governor ended up sinking after initial impact. And in that time, this 200 plus people had to rally themselves and get off the ship. And for the most part, they did. People reacted instantly. They managed to take a few things, but not much. Really, the decision was made at that time to save lives instead of valuables. So people grabbed family members and made a run for the Hartland. This was the other saving grace, is that they had the opportunity to get onto a functional vessel, so they didn't have to just rely on lifeboats, but they could actually jump onto the SS West Hartland from here. Here's an illustration looking at the accident as it happened. And again, it happened quick. In the middle of the night, 20 minutes from the moment that one 470-foot steamship luxury liner T-boned the other. In that time period, though, the Governor went up and then basically straight down to the bottom. Now, if it had sank just like that and like stuck into the ground, maybe 200 feet of the SS Governor would still be visible out of the water today. But after the remainder of the ship filled with water, it sank to the bottom about 240 feet down and is now laying on its side. When we're looking at the accounts that come out after that, it was, for the most part, an orderly escape for a lot of people. Survivor accounts, which were, in the multiple hundreds, recall it as being a terrifying experience, but a lucky one in that they reacted quickly and they managed to get off the ship and go from there. But the accounts of heroism are many, but the tragedies were still there. I think for me, the most tragic of the stories is of the Washburn family. So the Washburns are on the right-hand side of this photo here. Sadie and Oline, and then they had two girls with them. And it's Mr. Washburn standing up there on the right. So the Washburn family was actually asleep when the initial impact occurred, and they had the unfortunate luck of being basically right where the bow of the West Heartland penetrated the Governor, and it cut their cabin in half. Harry and Lucy Washburn were on one side of the cabin, and on the other side of the cabin were their two girls, Sadie, who was 8 years old, and Oline, who was 10 years old. And when the Heartland hit, the bow actually curved the steel of the Governor's hull backwards and pinched the door closed. It pretty seriously wounded Mr. Washburn and then trapped the two girls on their side of the cabin. Lucy and Mr. Washburn managed to escape, and they went back to bring back help and managed to bring back one officer and just another guy that they found with an axe and a crowbar. And they were trying to get that door to their cabin open, but unfortunately, because the steel of the Governor's hull had pinched it shut, they weren't able to get it open. So the Governor was filling up with more and more water at this point, and then Mr. Washburn dragged his wife away from the cabin, brought her up on deck, and was about to put her in a lifeboat when she broke away from him and ran back down to where the one officer was still trying to get the door open and refused to leave. She actually crawled back in through the hole on the other side and stayed with her two girls as the Governor went down. And there are accounts from survivors at the time that they could see these three Washburn women's eyes through the side of the ship as it eventually sank down. It's worth noting that that one officer also stayed behind and went down with the ship as well, trying to get the door open throughout to the very end there. By the end of this, only 8 lives were lost as the Governor went down, which in and of itself was a remarkable thing with over 200 people on board at the time. But the lives that were lost were incredibly tragic. It was, for a period of time there, listed as 9 lives that were lost, but there was one individual who apparently was having a rough patch with his wife, and so managed to escape and then pretended to be somebody else, claiming that he had died on board the vessel. Eventually, they tracked him down and took him off the list, bringing it back to 8 casualties of the SS Governor. But just goes to show that some situations really drive people to extremes, but they will always catch up with you at the end. Of the accounts here, you can see, going back through the newspaper articles, that really the best documentation of the Governor comes down to claims. So as they're going through here and talking to people who survived, you know, the tragedy of the Governor isn't so much recorded, not even close to the way that the SS Pacific haunts the minds of people in the area to this day. What really sticks out about the Governor is what was lost on board. I caught up with Robert here to talk to him a little bit about his experience, because he is one of the first people to successfully dive the Governor. And I would like for him to relay his experience about this ship with you.
The SS Governor was an interesting project. I was a diver. As a diver, it's one of the more challenging and dangerous dives in the Northwest. It's the deepest dive you can make without getting mixed gases to make the dive. There's one other shipwreck called the Admiral Sampson that's north of Seattle, but it's a little over 326 feet of water just to get down to the vessel. This one's in 240 feet of water, but the main deck resides at 200. And if you're foolhardy young and just want some adventure, you can actually make it down on the top of the deck of that ship with the normal air that we're breathing right now, just compressed into tanks. This was back in 1985 when I started diving this ship, and I got this idea, and it started my career in the marine industry, actually doing this project. I decided I wanted to go after and salvage whatever's salvageable off the ship. And contrary to a number of different articles, the ship was actually a luxury liner that plowed the roads and rode the waterways from San Pedro, California up into Canada, back into the Seattle area. And it was interesting at the time it's sinking, it was in Prohibition. So the people that wanted to get out, have a few drinks, have some gambling, and have a good entertainment, they would hop these ships, get offshore, and the bars would open up.
So a little more context on that, but I see some people here asking where specifically the ship is, and that's a great question. Thank you for asking. Just about a mile offshore from where the Point Wilson Lighthouse is in Port Townsend. So here's a map for you guys here. So basically, if you just go northeast from the Point Wilson Lighthouse there, it's a mile out from shore and then 240 feet down. And the complications of this dive are difficult to overstate, I think, because you have basically every factor that you can working against you. It's incredibly deep. As Robert mentioned, it's about as deep as you can go without serious consideration. It's as deep as you can go without taking mixed gas down there. It has a flux of currents and tides that work against it because it's at the mouth of the Puget Sound. And so the Pacific and the Puget Sound are clashing at this particular point, and the tides are fierce. Also, it's directly under a shipping lane. So the main commercial shipping lane goes directly over the wreck of the Governor. And it's heavily monitored by the U.S. Coast Guard. So the depth, the lack of visibility, the tides, the weather, almost everything is working against you to do this dive. And for a lot of divers, it's really considered the Mount Everest of dives, really in the area as well, because it's so incredibly deep and difficult. And the first dive attempts to even get down to it all got scuttled. Starting in the 1970s, paradivers, I believe, went down and managed to bring up an artifact from the ship to prove its identity. And then most attempts after that hit failure. At one point, one of the groups that went out to dive and recover pieces of the wreck, they had their diving barges set up out there, and they ended up getting hit by a container ship going through the area out there. At that point, they had to call the project. The other thing is that you really only have a narrow window to do it, where the seasonal tides will actually allow you to get down to this particular location without just getting swept away or entangled, because the ship itself provides a great deal of hazards that you have to consider working with as well. And we have some footage of one of the dives that Bob has done down there, and you can see just the cornucopia of things that you could get entangled on down there, bringing out all sorts of disaster. So we got a question here about whether or not it is still there. And yes, it absolutely is. Since sinking on April 1st, 1921, the entirety of the Governor remains down there. Obviously, because of the currents and everything, it has eroded a pretty significant degree, but there is a tremendous amount of the ship that is still down there. And really what intrigues people about it is what was left behind as well. And no, the people that perished on board never were recovered. It wasn't until the 70s that anyone actually went down and saw this part of the ship, and those who were trapped below never came back up to the surface, to my knowledge anyways. So lack of visibility, tide, current, high traffic area, It's a tremendously difficult and dangerous dive. It's down there lying on its starboard side, and you can, if you have the chops for it, go down and get it. But it's the things that remain on board that are so intriguing to everyone. So in 1976, when those two divers, Kelly Finn and Eric Morris, went down and found pieces to confirm the identity of it, immediately people were like, oh man, this is a treasure ship. This is a huge archaeological find, and there's a great deal of money tied into it. Because when you look at the accounts of what was lost on there, this Cadillac sedan automobile, the horses, the Studebaker coupe, it's a tremendous amount of really high profile items that were lost, but also things that you wouldn't normally consider as being valuable. In some cases, whiskey bottles from that time period can sell for many, many thousands of dollars if they're brought up from the bottom of the ocean. And these are things that were just casually thrown away at the time. To have them in incredible condition preserved down there as part of this historic wreck, it only increases the value. But if you recall, the real treasure behind this whole thing was the purser's safe. When all these wealthy and notable individuals were locking up their valuables on board the ship, they would put them in the purser's safe. And it is one of 3 safes on board the Governor that remain down on the bottom of the ocean down there, never recovered. To talk to you a little bit about that is, again, Master Diver Robert.
Well, there was a passenger on board. Her name was Vivian Small. And Vivian Small was bringing a considerable amount of money to Seattle to take with her husband to the India to buy it was a textile factory production. And she was carrying considerable amount of money that was in gold coin, because they didn't accept our script at that time. The world was pretty uneasy with paper when they needed gold. So she went to San Pedro, picked up the amount of money, which she told me was $20,000, and put it aboard the safe, the purser's safe. We know there was stocks and bonds from AT&T from 1921 that are in that safe. I was on site when one of the writers for the TNT, or the Seattle Times, which we had a little argument going about, was the ship a tramp steamer or was it really a high class? And I produced some things like the menu for the time before its transportation, and cockalisi, I still don't know what that is, but that was featured on the menu. He was contacted by a woman whose mother claimed to be a passenger aboard that vessel. Now, the woman's whose account is on the newspaper article, which you have a copy of, her last name was Barbara Hunsisch, and she divorced and got married to a gentleman named Small. And her daughter was 1 year old. And I was called from the project in 1987 to make a mad rush with our documentary team, because this woman was in a rest home. She was very, very sharp, alert. Her body was pretty fragile. And her daughter, which was 1 year old in 1921, and this was 1987, she was up in age too. And this woman recounted this story of the night, and she made it very clear to this newspaper editor. And then he contacted me, and the story she related was about the $20,000 in gold coin that's sitting inside this safe. Well, if you went to the safe in April, or went to a bank in April, the distribution of coins for that era from East Coast, or all the mints, Denver, is pretty thorough. The United States, that's the first end of the first quarter. If there's just one $20 gold piece from 1921, the last one sold in auction at $1.4 million. They didn't produce very many. It was the lowest year for production of $20 gold pieces. And then there was coin collections, jewelry collections. The safe was a large safe. So the safe is going to be a treasure trove. The captain's safe has the ship's money Every ship that traveled internationally carried gold or currency of some kind that was accepted in the ports they went to in case they had a breakdown and needed to be repairs. A lot of times, and it was true by Jack Brandon, the quartermaster, that the ship's payroll was also on there, and they were due to be paid in Seattle. And then you have the safe in the stern, which is the safe for the gambling, the casino, the drinking. So you have 3 safes to go look for. Truly, the purser safe is what the one might consider to be the most valuable. But when you look at the cosmetics and the old eyeliners that women use that are of that era, these artifacts, which are hard to find, they all have value and they need to be put on display so people can see. So there has to be profit motivation to bring these up, get them restored, and get them put into a museum so they can be curated properly and shown to anyone interested about what life was like on the SS Governor in 1921, moments before its demise.
And that is really key to this story here. So when Bob first goes down and starts bringing up artifacts from this ship, it really is a time capsule of that time. Here's a few examples of things that have been found down there, from watches and rings to an actual side of the ship. They brought up this portal here, as well as a significant amount of brass. And then one of my favorites is actually the flatware of the Pacific Steamship Company as well. To look at these things is really extraordinary. But again, people are always drawn back to the fact that there is this wealth down there. Now, of the items of those 3 safes, the purser's safe is still a mystery, although Bob is pretty confident that he knows the location of it today. The captain's safe is still missing, but the casino safe that was on the stern of the vessel has been found and its location has been marked, but it's under about 6 feet of silt and it has never been brought up back to the surface. One of the complications to that is just, of course, again, the difficulty of diving this wreck. Because it's in such a treacherous area and requires a great deal to go down there at all, it's not an expedition that a lot of people take on. As the technology has advanced, however, they have more and more clues and a better idea of what happened to the vessel and where those items that have long been a mystery have gone. Because one of the original problems in this first sort of dive expedition that was undertaken here is the fact that it's difficult to get down there. And then once you're down there, it's not easy to see stuff. You really have to take one or more dives just to find yourself oriented down there. Because the visibility is so bad, a lot of it was exploratory before you could even begin looking for the things. You had to find out where you were on the map before you could start finding anything after that. It's definitely a project that has called Bob back to it again and again. And I asked him what it was that's drawing him back, because he originally went there in the 1980s and then again in 1992, which was, for all accounts, considered the most productive dive on this particular wreck as far as items recovered. But it's something that he is gung-ho to go back for, despite a healthy number of shipwrecks that he has explored and a tremendous amount of archaeological artifacts that he's brought up for preservation. This is the one that seems to summon his heart back, and here's why he wants to go back in his own words.
The age-old question is, did I finish everything I wanted to do in my life? This was in 1985. I started this. 1987, we launched a major SAT operation for salvage. And we came up with watches, gold rings, lots of dishes. Even I have a major coffee cup I use. It's actually, it's a bedpan, but it's came off the wreck. We have lots of china. I have watches, gold watches, a lot of personal effects that were left, because when this event occurred, people just left everything to get off. They didn't think about their 1921 touring Cadillac down the cargo hold, or their racehorses, or all of their sea chests that were full of their valuables. When people traveled back then, they carried a lot of their valuables with them so they wouldn't be lost and robbed while they were going away on trips. And it's a desire to take the knowledge I've learned since 1985 and go back and finish this. And I guess it's, what do you call that? Your bucket list, one of the bucket list things to do.
So now that they've re-examined this, the big things that have changed his mind about the location of the safe are, first and foremost, the way that the governor sank. So we had a lot of questions about this as to like what happened here. And you can see a mathematic projection of what happened here as it started to take on water and then essentially went straight up before sinking down to the bottom down there. The other is the ability to actually look with side scan sonar, I don't know why that's so difficult to say, at a really more detailed image of the ship itself. And then there are pages and pages of mathematic equations looking at every variable that you possibly can, from the way that the ship sank to the conditions on that particular night to everything that could have happened that, in Bob's own words, has allowed him to speak ocean. And now he has a better idea of where these artifacts could have drifted after the sinking of the Governor. Today, while it's still down there, it remains incredibly difficult to dive. And once you take a look at just sort of the conditions down there, it becomes even more prevalent. But the preservation of what's down there is really remarkable. So I have some video clips for you guys of the actual wreck that I want you to see. So I got some good questions here. First of all, Randall's talking about, I believe that you actually did this dive, if I'm reading the clues here, on mixed gases. I know that that is the preferred way to do it because of the depth down there. And yes, Julian, he did say bedpan. He uses an old bedpan as his coffee cup down there, which just goes to show life can be even more interesting than you originally expected. Of the items that have been recovered that are most notable, the ship's bell is one that has been brought up and then cleaned and is now on presentation. But the purser safe is the one that continues to intrigue people. And a good example of how that can captivate people's minds is of the SS Central America. This was a similar ship, but it wasn't quite as long as a 280-foot side wheel steamer, but it had a similar role of operating as a major transit line. Its route was from Central America to the East Coast during the 1850s. And this particular vessel sank on September 3rd, 1857, with 477 passengers on board and 101 crew. And only 55 people survived this particular incident. But what really captured the mind of people was the same thing that did on the Governor, was the items that were left on board. And in 2014, the SS Central America, that vast treasure hold of items was actually recovered. And just a tremendous amount of gold coins, historic artifacts, personal jewelry, and really well-preserved items that were indicative of that time came up. And the Governor has a very similar storyline to it, in that if you were to bring it back, you could really look through the looking glass into that time period. And I think Bob articulates it even more so than I can right here.
What makes the Governor unique is it's as common as any ship of that type in that era. It's unique because it's resting here basically in one piece, which is dilapidated down considerably. But it's an example of what the average travel was like back in 1921 aboard a ship. The Governor had a sister ship called the President, built exactly the same. When the safes were ordered, they ordered two, one for the President, one for the Governor. The only difference between the two is the President had only one stack. didn't have two stacks. But other than that, they were the same ship. It was not anything unique in its design, but it's just an example right here in our backyard of what an era, a time when travel was dependent on the ocean. Not like today where we can hop on jets and we're there pretty quick, but also the decadence and the quality of that travel if you could afford it.
What I particularly like about this vessel is its relatability. Despite the difficulty of the dive, it is, like Bob said, it is the poster child of that era. And to have it here is really extraordinary. The other thing that I really love about it is the flip side, the challenge of this dive. So there are only a handful of people out there who have successfully managed to get down to the SS Governor. After, I'm trying to think when it happened, late 1980s, Robert Mester's company maintained through the courts salvage rights to this particular vessel. So anything that is brought back up ends up going to his company and then can be dispersed through museums and so forth beyond that. But the allure of finding it remains very strong to this day. And I think in our near future, we'll hopefully see a new expedition mounted down to the SS Governor to finally recover, if not the entirety, certainly the crown jewel artifacts of this particular item down there. I would be intrigued to see it just because it's so representative of what I think of as a really undertold storyline in this area. For some reason, from the Mosquito fleet to really the presence of the automobile, there's just this missing page in the Puget Sound's history. And I'm not sure why the luxury steamliner gets overlooked so often, considering a significant number of the shipwrecks in the area were actually of these different types of large passenger liner steamships moving around in the area. To give you a thought on this, I've got Bob again.
In 1985, I was 31. Oh, actually 31 in 1986. And my career had been mostly in military type of work, diving wise. And I came to the Northwest and found this desire to go and look at this ship. And of course, at a man 30, 31, I'm looking at everything that was shiny gold and worth a lot of money. But over the years, over 40 years, I've learned to understand that the gold and shiny is nice, but there's also the other things which speaks to the individual's life, and it's a little part of what has been lost until somebody like myself or many young people coming into the world today using the technology we have now, which is far superior to what we had back in the 1980s. And they're able to touch that time and bring it forward. And I'm really glad to see that. I just hope I hope that it gets more interest. When people in Arizona that have no desert whatsoever turn on TV and watch Jacques Cousteau for series after series after series about the ocean, obviously we have an interest in the ocean. And it's so much we don't know about it. We know more about the moon and Mars, absolutely for sure, than we do about the deepest depths of the ocean. But it's changing slowly.
So the future looks bright for the recovery of the SS Governor. And for my part, I would like to see it really taffied out even more, which is what we are hoping to do on the anniversary, April 1st of this particular year. We're going to be doing a Q&A session with Bob there and hopefully bringing to light, doing a deep dive, if you will, on a lot more of the questions of this particular vessel. But I wanted just to bring your attention to it in the grander sense of the narrative as well, of these steamships that used to travel throughout the area and didn't just carry the people, but the artifacts in a time when items were truly unique and not mass produced, but bore the stamp of an era valiantly. With that, I always want to encourage you guys, if you have enjoyed your tour tonight, you can always tip your guide on the homepage of prettygrittytours.com. We do have a little button down there for PayPal. If you would like to show your appreciation through a monetary donation, I promise not to throw it into the bottom of the ocean to be recovered later. We always reinvest it in producing more fantastic tours for the Greater South Sound region. If you guys have questions, comments, concerns, please let me know. There have been multiple dives that have gone down on the SS Governor, and there is a sizable amount of video footage of that particular one. And we really hope to showcase more of that with the Q&A session with Robert here on April 1st. But in the meantime, we are encouraging you guys to stay curious, keep on exploring out there. And if you have any thoughts on places that you would like to see in the area, please let us know. The Foss Waterway Seaport is a great supporter of the waterways of the Puget Sound, and we're always happy to taffy new things up. So until next time, thank you guys so much. I'm Chris Staudinger with Pretty Gritty Tours here for the Foss Waterway Seaport. I'll see you guys next time.